The assembly had been anticipated to accommodate a standard gathering, a straightforward presentation. Yet, within moments, Parliament exploded into turmoil. What had commenced as an ordinary assembly rapidly transformed into an arena of charges, yelling, accusatory gestures, and incendiary disclosures. At the center of this tempest stood a general, grasping a substantial brown document that he asserted contained the most incriminating proof ever exhibited against a serving president. South Africans observed in astonishment as he ascended from his position, the strain in the space tangible, requesting the inconceivable, the instant detention of President Cyril Ramaphosa. The territory was seized by a mixture of alarm, expectation, and ambiguity as the gathering that was intended to be standard became a characterizing governmental instance. Before this eruption of unmatched sentiment, Parliament had been simmering with strain. Weeks of governmental coercion, graft assertions, and internal divisions within the African National Congress had positioned the governing organization in unstable equilibrium. Yet, nobody could have anticipated the scale of what was to transpire. As MPs settled in, Mkhwanazi rose and elevated the envelope above his cranium, announcing, "South Africa has been deceived. This administration has been seized by graft at the supreme tier. Today I am requesting this assembly to sanction a detention authorization for President Cyril Ramaphosa." The term struck like a thunderous blast, instantly fragmenting the delicate tranquility of the assembly. The reaction was instant and incendiary. Some MPs shouted in endorsement, experiencing vindication by what they understood as a long-delayed act of responsibility. Others screamed in incredulity, incapable to absorb the audacity of Mkhwanazi's request. A third collective rushed the platform, insisting he withdraw his declaration. Protection staff had to intercede, restraining participants from both divisions of the corridor to avert physical altercations. The presiding officer struggled to preserve discipline, but the space had already descended into a vortex of disorder. It was a spectacle that seized the territory's concentration in immediate time as observers across South Africa pursued the progressions with suspended anticipation. Once discipline was provisionally re-established, Mkhwanazi persisted, unaffected by the animosity surrounding him. He commenced elaborating what he asserted to be recently revealed proof associated with persistent deception probes, monetary paths, and restricted documentation indicating to the suspected exploitation of administration resources. He described questionable movements to international accounts and participation by multiple elevated-ranking ANC administrators. According to Mkhwanazi, these records explicitly connected President Ramaphosa in dubious foundation initiatives, covert monetary operations, and confidential assemblies with persons formally identified in probes. Though unconfirmed at this juncture, the mere charges were incendiary enough to generate a territorial outcry. The resistance instantly seized the instance, shouting declarations that embodied years of dissatisfaction. "We recognized it. This is what we've been declaring. South Africa warrants the reality," they exclaimed loudly, their utterances reverberating across the assembly. The attitude resonated with the civilian population that was progressively cautious of administration graft and desired responsibility. Seldom does accumulated doubt discover such a forum for articulation, with the spectacle of governance in complete observation seemingly confirming apprehensions held by numerous residents. The ANC predictably responded with fury. Organization participants accused Mkhwanazi of coordinating a governmental ambush to exploit the internal strains and compromise the president's governance. Senior MPs ascended to challenge the charge as nothing more than governmental spectacle with absolutely no judicial foundation. They maintained that the president had conformed to all the guidelines and accused Mkhwanazi of endeavoring to provoke civilian animosity and destabilize administration frameworks. The confrontation between resistance utterances and the governing organization intensified the spectacle, with Parliament transforming into a platform for authority conflict. Mkhwanazi declined to retreat. He struck the document before him on the surface and stated, "You can reject it now, but these records will communicate for themselves. South Africa will recognize the reality. His defiance intensified the circumstances even further. More shouting, departures, and crisis deliberations among MPs. The assembly had become a spectacle of confrontation where every motion, every declaration, and response contributed to the strain rather than addressing it. Digital platforms exploded in the consequence as recordings of the parliamentary collapse became widespread. South Africans were completely fragmented between characterizing Mogoeng as a courageous advocate who finally had communicated reality to authority, compelling responsibility where none had existed for far too extended, and those who perceived the display as a deliberate maneuver that would destabilize Ramaphosa and contribute to sectional confrontations within the ANC. For this subsequent collective, the action was governmental sabotage, not an ethical campaign, and they cautioned of potential ramifications for territorial continuity. Hours from the parliamentary explosion, a declaration by the President's administration intensified the civilian controversy. The declaration by Ramaphosa characterized the charges as groundless, irresponsible, and slanderous, stressing that the President was not going to be deterred by governmentally fabricated defamation operations. The reaction had materialized, but the harm had already been executed. According to commentators, the ANC was now in more profound emergency than ever documented. There were additional internal fragmentations, resistance coercion at unprecedented tiers, and a further erosion in the distrust of administration organizations. But more significantly, the demand for a detention authorization, irrespective of its legitimacy, had ignited a controversy that would not diminish anytime shortly. The confrontation generated fundamental inquiries about the character of responsibility and governance in South Africa. Was Mogoeng's intervention a courageous act of reality articulation, a required confrontation with graft at the supreme tier? Or was it a tactically deliberate assault designed at compromising the governance of Ramaphosa with the context of sectional disputes within the ANC? For commentators, reporters, and residents alike, these inquiries were discussed and the responses had the capacity to reconfigure the governmental terrain for years to materialize. But beyond the assembly, reverberations were experienced across the territory. Civilian institutions insisted independent probes, cautioning against attempts to reject or reduce the disclosures. Financiers and international spectators were apprehensive about the potential consequences for governance and strategy continuity, indicating to the broader ramifications of the governmental upheaval. The confrontation became representative of the greater conflicts that materialize inherently with democratic apparatuses where openness, responsibility, and governmental endurance often converge in very intricate and unpredictable fashions. The instant consequence witnessed concentrated operation behind the curtain as governmental approach gatherings, crisis deliberations, and internal consultations dominated the chambers of critical leaders. Every participant from Mogoeng and Ramaphosa to senior ANC administrators and resistance personalities weighed his subsequent maneuver cautiously. Commentators predicted the approaching weeks would establish whether the organization could preserve cohesion or if the confrontation would generate an extended interval of instability that might reconfigure authority forces within the governing organization and the territory at large. The press undoubtedly performed a substantial function in intensifying the emergency through immediate reporting, professional examinations, and persistent updates. Indeed, every declaration, disclosure, and civilian response was examined, probed, and discussed. Such saturation generated a situation in which civilian sentiment clashed with governmental manipulation and press accounts to escalate the examination on all participants. The occurrence very much became a discussion subject for residents as a location of conversation, controversy, and introspection toward how governance was malfunctioning in South Africa. This in sequence had serious repercussions on wider matters of governance and governmental confidence. For the ANC, it was an equilibrium exercise to suppress internal dissent while preserving civilian assurance. Resistance organizations capitalized on the understood vulnerabilities revealed by Mogoeng's disclosures, intensifying governmental rivalry and escalating demands for responsibility. The episode emphasized for the residents of South Africa the vulnerability of governmental confidence and the critical function of openness and ethical governance in maintaining democratic organizations. As days transformed into weeks, the inquiries about the confrontation only expanded. Would independent probes verify that indeed there was something to be troubled about and ignite comprehensive transformation and responsibility? Or would the occurrences diminish into a spectacular but comparatively inconsequential episode within the wider sequence of governmental manipulation? Every record, every declaration, and every governmental determination assumed additional significance. The alarming immediacy of the parliamentary collapse had transformed it into a representation of how the territory confronted inquiries of governance, integrity, and responsibility at the very summit. What was intended to be a standard gathering of Parliament had now become a characterizing instance in the governmental existence of South Africa. It revealed very profound divisions within the governing organization, demonstrated the precarious consequences of governmental contests, and emphasized the instability of civilian assurance in organizations of administration. The confrontation became a reflection and magnification of comprehensive difficulties, emphasizing the vulnerability of the equilibrium of authority and the persistent dangers to governmental continuity. The territory was thrown into an interval of exceptional examination and controversy in the consequence. Every maneuver by Mkhwanazi, Ramaphosa, and the ANC was saturated with wider importance, potentially affecting matters of governance, assurance, and governmental continuity. Commentators advised that this confrontation might overflow into extensive ramifications from organization cohesion to greater inquiries regarding the boundaries of responsibility and openness within democratic structures. South Africans remained fixated to progressions, completely cognizant that the results of this episode could reconfigure the trajectory of territorial governance. The confrontation also functioned as a pronounced reminder of the authority of personal action in influencing governmental results. Mkhwanazi's determination to communicate, equipped with the records he asserted were irrefutable, contested conventions, interrupted anticipations, and compelled a territory to address uncomfortable realities. Whether this would ultimately be recalled as a courageous position for responsibility or a deliberate governmental manipulation depended on subsequent progressions and the consequences of probes. But in that one instance, it did very powerfully demonstrate the capability of a solitary participant to effect territorial dialogue and modify the trajectory of governance to South Africans. It crystallized persistent apprehensions over graft, governance integrity, and the mechanisms accessible for maintaining administrators responsible. It ignited concentrated conversations in residences, employment locations, and civilian zones, instilling one with a perception of the vulnerability of organizational confidence. The civilian population became a participant in the developing spectacle, the examination contributing to the coercion on governmental participants to respond, clarify, and warrant. The confrontation, initially restricted to the assembly, had overflowed into every dimension of civilian existence, influencing understandings and anticipations in immediate time. As governmental commentators, the press, and residents alike persisted to observe occurrences, it materialized to be apparent that the gathering would be recalled as one of the characterizing instances, an instance wherein persistent simmering strains erupted, compelling openness, contesting authority, and reconfiguring governmental boundaries. Its repercussions extended beyond instant organization forces into zones such as inquiries of governance, organizational strength, and ethical responsibilities of governance. South Africa had advanced into a fresh period of governmental consciousness where responsibility and transformation were at the very forefront of territorial dialogue. The coercion on all implicated had intensified consistently in the weeks after the confrontation. Probes were committed. Internal deliberations persisted and the civilian attention did not reduce. Every declaration, every determination, and every governmental maneuver was examined in specifics for its ramifications in an atmosphere in which the consequences of action and passivity were enormous. The territory was on elevated awareness, definite that the confrontation had released forces that would potentially reconstruct governmental culture and anticipations for generations. More than a spectacular episode, it was an instance for contemplation, controversy, and conceivable modification. It emphasized strains inherent in governance, the vulnerability of organizational confidence and responsibilities of leaders toward integrity. For South Africans, it was to remind them that governmental responsibility, though often disputed and not absent of danger, remained integral to democratic vitality. An exceptional confrontation in Parliament with Mo going at the forefront and Ramaphosa on the defensive position had transformed into a characterizing instance that emphasized the intricacy, instability, and implications participating in governmental existence in a territory striving toward openness and accountability. The occurrences of that gathering would not be rapidly forgotten. They constituted, as it were, a transformation moment, an instance when difficulties crystallized, vulnerabilities became apparent, and the paths forward toward transformation or additional confrontation were illuminated. South Africans observing and discussing observed one of those instances in their territory's governmental progression, an instance which would establish dialogue, anticipations, and determinations for numerous years to materialize. In the concluding occurrence, this spectacular and exceptional confrontation within Parliament manifested more comprehensive conflicts of South Africa, a conflict over reality, responsibility, and a governmental culture supportive of responsibilities imposed by authority.